Hello, America. I'm Mark Levin, and this is Life, Liberty, and Levin Sunday, the eve before the great inauguration of the 47th president, who was the 45th president. Now, when you add 47 and 45, you get 92. A caller to my radio show mentioned, Grover Cleveland's second term was in 1892, the only other president to have two non-consecutive terms. I thought I'd tell you that. Why? I don't know. It's kind of cool. But we're going to have this fantastic inauguration, and thank God we are. And I want to remind you of the efforts by the legal system, by judges, by prosecutors, the so-called Department of Justice, which I call the Department of Injustice, that they wanted to prevent this day. They wanted to prevent the American people from being able to elect Donald Trump president. They sought to put Donald Trump in prison. And right up to the 11th hour, they're still trying to smear Donald Trump with reports. The January 6th report, 153 pages, where the Biden regime, Merrick Garland, the so-called Attorney General, Jack Smith, the unconstitutional prosecutor who has skipped town as fast as he can, they put out a report condemning Donald Trump, laying out how they would have held him criminally responsible, how he would have been convicted, and on and on and on. They wanted to take it right into the inauguration. And so I need to address this. Hopefully a final time, but unlikely. Enormous damage has been done to our criminal justice system by the Biden regime, the Department of Justice, and these people. Tremendous damage done to the rule of law, the justice system, presidential politics. The dark side of prosecutorial abuse has been reached. You've seen it. The entire nation has seen it. So I reluctantly conclude what is now beyond obvious. There's way too much power in the hands of prosecutors. Way too much. Way too much discretion in the hands of prosecutors. And it's destroying faith and trust in our entire justice system. But their power keeps increasing. And so it's going to be left to Donald Trump, Pam Bondi, Kash Patel to do something about it. And something must be done about it. I want to read something to you. This is all so important. That was delivered by Attorney General Robert Jackson on April 1st, 1940, to a room of prosecutors. He was an FDR Democrat. He had been U.S. Solicitor, the Solicitor General of the United States. He became Attorney General, and then later he was an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court. In 1945, he took a leave from the court to be the chief American prosecutor at the Nuremberg trials. This is what he said, and it's very, very important. It's incredibly prescient. He said to the room of prosecutors it would probably be within the range of that exaggeration permitted in Washington to say that assembled in this room of prosecutors, one of the most powerful peacetime forces known to our country. The prosecutor has more control over life, liberty, and the reputation than any other person in America. His discretion is tremendous. He can have citizens investigated, and if he's that kind of person, he can have this done to the tune of public statements and veiled or unveiled intimations. Or the prosecutor may choose a more subtle course and simply have a citizen's friends interviewed. Prosecutor can order arrests, present cases to a grand jury in secret session, and on the basis of his one-sided presentation of the facts can cause the citizen to be indicted and held for trial. He may dismiss the case before trial, in which case the defense never has a chance to be heard. This all sound familiar to you? Or he may go on with a public trial. If he obtains a conviction, the prosecutor can still make recommendations as to the sentence, as to whether the prisoner should get probation or a suspended sentence, and after he's put away, as to whether he is a fit subject for parole. Again, what does this sound like to you? Well, the prosecutor at his best is one of the most beneficent forces in our society. When he acts from malice or other base motives, he's one of the worst. Does that sound like Jack Smith to you and Alvin Bragg to you? If the prosecutor is obliged to choose his cases, it follows that he can choose his defendants. Therein is the most dangerous power of the prosecutor, that he will pick people that he thinks should get, rather than pick cases that need to be prosecuted. With the law books filled with a great assortment of crimes, a prosecutor stands a fair chance of finding at least a technical violation, or the 1871 Ku Klux Klan Act, as an example, of some act on the part of almost anyone, In such a case, it's not a question of discovering the commission of a crime and then looking for the man who has committed it. It's a question of picking the man and then searching the law books or putting investigators to work to pin some offense on him. It is in this realm to which the prosecutor picks some person whom he dislikes or desires to embarrass, or selects some group of unpopular persons, and then looks for an offense that the greatest danger of abuse of prosecuting power lies. It is here that the law enforcement becomes personal, and the real crime becomes that of being unpopular with the predominant or governing group. Again, sound familiar? Being attached to the wrong political views, or being personally obnoxious to or in the way of the prosecutor himself. In times of fear or hysteria, political, racial, religious, social, and economic groups, often from the best of motives, cry for the scalps of individuals or groups because they do not like their views. Particularly do we need to be dispassionate and courageous in those cases which deal with so-called subversive activities. They are dangerous to civil liberty because the prosecutor has no definite standards to determine what constitutes a subversive activity, such as we have for murder or larceny. He goes on. Those who are in office are apt to regard as subversive the activities of any of those who would bring about a change of administration. Some of our soundest constitutional doctrines were once punished as subversive. We must not forget that it was not so long ago that both the term Republican and the term Democrat were epithets with sinister meaning to denote persons of radical tendencies that were subversive of the order of things then dominant. And he closes like this. The qualities of a good prosecutor are as elusive and as impossible to define as those which mark a gentleman. And those who need to be told would not understand it anyway. A sensitiveness to fair play and sportsmanship is perhaps the best protection against the abuse of power. And the citizen's safety lies in the prosecutor who tempers zeal with human kindness, who seeks truth and not victims, who serves the law and not factional purposes, and who approaches his task with humility. The late Justice Robert Jackson, who describes Jack Smith, Alvin Bragg, and the rest of the reprobates. Ladies and gentlemen, you've witnessed this. We have an imbalance of the prosecutor's power in our country right now, an imbalance. Prosecutorial discretion. Prosecutors decide cases, individuals, crimes, pleas, trials. They help determine dates, what evidence they will or will not use. It's an all-encompassing power. The prosecutor's decisions resonate throughout the system, make determinations on what police, federal or state, will investigate, what the judiciary will do, what part of the Bill of Rights will be used or not. They determine our prison capacity, which laws to prioritize or not. Ultimately, what is or is not socially acceptable. You have a massive breach of even this all-encompassing discretionary power when you leap into politics, which is what we have witnessed. A massive breach of norms, of practice, of tradition. That's what lawfare is. That is what was done to Donald Trump and is still being done to Donald Trump. The involvement in presidential elections, where we used to believe a presidential candidate or a president was immune from such activity. Again, traditions and practices violated. The timing of cases we saw to create maximum political damage to Donald Trump. Charging documents filled with information, what we call talking indictments, in order to influence juries, in order to influence an election and the public and the media to political effects. This discretion, witnesses, which ones to use, grand juries, jurisdictions, investigations, which laws, the establishment and enlistment of courts, even the Supreme Court, dragged into this prosecutor's abuse of discretion. You move from criminal justice, an enormous power, to the criminalization of politics. That's what we saw take place. Even more, a special prosecutor, more power than a usual prosecutor. They can focus all the attention, unlimited financial resources, unlimited personnel, FBI, other prosecutors, on one person. Investigations, talking indictments, talking motions, political investigative techniques, SWAT teams sent to the president's home for maximum effect as he's preparing or running for president of the United States. So now we have a report. You see, ladies and gentlemen, Jack Smith had to drop his cases against Donald Trump because we have half a century of policy by the Department of Justice that the federal Department of Justice and their prosecutors can't interfere with a sitting president, which Donald Trump will be in hours. So they couldn't continue their cases. They tried. They rushed. They got Chutkan, their favorite judge. The Supreme Court intervened and said, no, we've got immunity. No, we're not going to rush. No, but they did. They moved that calendar. Chutkan moved it. They wanted to get to Trump. They wanted him convicted. They wanted him to lose. They wanted him in prison, but they failed. So now the last slight, a report. If you're a private citizen, and a prosecution isn't completed to the end, or under any other circumstances, a prosecutor doesn't get to issue a report. A prosecutor speaks in court. The job of a prosecutor is to do justice on behalf of the public. It's not to do injustice and track down and hunt a presidential candidate and try and prevent them from becoming president of the United States. And even now, they time a report, 2 reports really, to be released. And they released right before the inauguration to try and smear Donald Trump, undermine his presidency, influence the reporting of the day. Jack Smith, the Jack Ripper of government, the Jack Ripper of the law. We get this report unheard of in other circumstances. In fact, utterly unethical in every other circumstance, and I would argue especially here. Legal, ethical, due process protections, all rejected because a prosecutor says, I would have convicted him. I would have convicted him. If I had the chance, he was a dead man walking. Prosecutors don't get to do that sort of thing. They don't get to exercise that kind of discretion. They claim to be judge, jury, and executioner. A complete violation of our traditions, our mores, going all the way back 1,000 years ago to the Magna Carta. This regime, this Department of Justice, this prosecutor has violated 1,000 years of the growth of our justice system, of our due process system, of our legal system. And they tried to do this to affect the election, the office of the presidency, the inauguration. No administration will be in a better position to do 2 things than the Trump administration under Pam Bondi. 1, hold those who so comprehensively violated our justice system, our norms, our practices, accountable, starting with a comprehensive investigation of everybody's role and everything they did if we're going to get our justice system back for you and me, Mr. and Mrs. America. Number 2, a full investigation and examination of prosecutorial power at the federal level, because it's out of control. It's not what it ought to be. These prosecutors are way too powerful. These federal prosecutors, state and local too, but there's no authority there for this administration, including the extent to which it is now completely out of balance in our legal system, completely out of balance. Justice Jackson gave us the warning. Well, it's here, and it's now. Lawfare is conclusive evidence of the out-of-balance system when prosecutors have this kind of power to reach into the political system, to reach into the electoral system in the various states, to reach into a presidential election, to reach into a presidential inauguration. That has got to stop. January 6th is another perfect example. All these innocent people who did no violence, Complete out of balance discretion of prosecutors. They've abused their power. The division of power, the separation of power exists within our justice system, but it's clearly morphed in a way that is utterly unrecognizable. I'm not talking about adopting all the nonsense that the ACLU and liberals and the rest of them are talking about. I'm not talking about that. But we need an honest, thorough look at the out-of-whack discretionary power of these federal prosecutors, because they are the most powerful public officials in our republic. And none of them are elected. And the judicial system is not armed properly to control them. They have way too much power, way too much discretion. And so on the eve of the inauguration of the 47th president, who is a great president, who will be a great president, the Department of Justice needs to make sure that this never, ever happens again. The utter imbalance of the power of the prosecutor, it needs to be dealt with.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.